Hello everyone. Today we are going to be reading Fairy Tales for Millennials, written by Bruno Vincent. This is a story that you should know well, Snow White, but this is a different take on it. I hope you enjoy. In a distant land there once lived a queen. Her beloved husband had died many years before, and she'd been left to rule the kingdom alone. Each morning she stood before her ornate gilt mirror and spoke the same words. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? All right, said the mirror, top stories. Remember Mother Hubbard? How she looks now will amaze you. No, said the Queen, I'm not interested in that stuff. Humpty Dumpty, in intensive care after trying to scale border wall. Please, mirror. Rumpelstiltskin's lawyer issues a statement denying any wrongdoing. Mirror. Please, no more. Sorry, Your Grace, the mirror said. Forgot who I was talking to. Everyone else loves that stuff. Be that as it may, the Queen said. Just tell me, who is the fairest? Bear with me. Accessing Kingdom Equality Index. While she waited, the Queen touched up her hair in the mirror and thought about the sweeping changes she had implemented in the kingdom. Her husband, missed as he was, had been a bit of a dinosaur. So no sooner had the last tray of funeral sandwiches been deposited in the castle's recycling caddy than the Queen had begun drawing up plans to make Fairyland a better place to live. First to go were the outdated expectations that everyone had to do the same job as their parents. The daughter of a dairymaid, for instance, need not feel that her future stretched ahead of her milking Bluebell and Penelope and warding off farm boys. Thanks to systems put in place by the Queen, she could now access further education and get qualifications to improve her life. Through hard work, she might pass her exams and become a physiotherapist or a lecturer in fine art. Gone also was the system of preferment. Slightly more than half the positions in court were now filled by women, and the ethnicity of those who held office reflected, as accurately as possible, the demographics of the populace. Despite a few early mutterings, people quickly realised the benefits of a decision-making apparatus that more closely reflected society, and all protestations melted away. A wider range of perspectives were heard and understood. Policy implementation and communication were enormously improved, and the government as a whole ran with efficiency. The formerly rigid hierarchy learned to flex and bend, and in one bold leap, the concept of social mobility moved from merely possible to a gleaming actuality. Put simply, things functioned and people were happy. But the Queen didn't stop there. Old stories that promoted outdated values were brought up to date. Mary's lamb was allowed to go everywhere with her and was officially registered as an emotional support animal. The tortoise and the hare were deemed both to deserve a medal simply for competing in the race, and the boy who cried wolf was diagnosed with truth aversion disorder and sent on a course for counselling. Everyone agreed that these new versions were a huge improvement, partly, of course, because there wasn't much option but to agree. There may have been the occasional grimace or raised eyebrow from the old folks, but that was the behaviour of old folks throughout the ages. But the grumbling was minimal, and the large majority celebrated that their society was more equal and just. The Queen Generous was her name, Jenny for short, enjoyed great popularity when she wasn't opening a new ward at the local hospital or auctioning off her old gowns for charity. She would cast her gaze around the kingdom in search of further ways to improve life for her subjects, or at least for those subjects who were not unfairly benefiting from the unhappiness and poverty of others. And so, as she stood waiting in front of her magical mirror on this sunny morning, she was not without a little complacency. The mirror, an antique, was still growing accustomed to its new settings and sometimes got mixed up when accessing the fairness index. The fact that the mirror still occasionally defaulted to equating fairness with being blonde and young may have had something to do with its confusion. However, she didn't mind waiting, because no matter how long it took, there was only one face the mirror ever showed under the banner Most Fair. That was the Queen's own. So she was bemused rather than angry to find herself looking at another's face. "Mirror," she said patiently, "is there something wrong? I feel sure the palace coffers can stretch to a new mirror." But the mirror, usually so happy to jest, remained formal. "There's no error, Your Grace," it said. "What you see is the truth. Snow White is the fairest in the land." Now, I've not mentioned Snow White up to this point. You might happen to think that that's down to laziness or bad storytelling. You might, on the other hand, mutter to yourself, "Snow White, eh? Not the Queen as expected," and mark it down as a rather snazzy rug pull on my part. I shan't try to persuade you either way. We all have to live our own truth. Nevertheless, here she is now, Snow White, the daughter of the dead king from a former marriage, and doted upon by her father. Gossips in court liked to speculate that this ate at the new queen and that she was jealous of her stepdaughter. Obviously, these gossips have too much time on their hands, and they decided that there was a serious rivalry between Snow White and the Queen. Now the mirror was saying that Snow White was the fairest. It was a bitter blow. The Queen was certain the mirror must be mistaken. She switched the mirror off and on again and ran the calculations a second and a third time. As the mirror's voice reeled off the remarkable list of Snow White's achievements, the Queen went pale. The Queen knew Snow White and had spent years travelling the land helping the poor and unfortunate, but she hadn't realised exactly how much the princess had accomplished. It seemed Snow White had used her meagre royal allowance to set up a family planning centre in the city slums. She'd secured sponsorship from a major quill manufacturer for a grant scheme for emerging writers from underprivileged backgrounds and distant provinces. She'd also established a universal court of historical justice to examine claims of historical land theft and ethnic cleansing by the first human settlers against the indigenous swamp goblins. Furthermore, she had declared her intention to dismantle the monarchy entirely, replacing it with a representational democracy, perhaps with a constitutional monarchy to encourage tourism, if it should be such as the wish of the people. Once these projects were complete, the business of wealth redistribution could commence. Everyone was going crazy for Snow White's initiatives. Of course they were. As she reached the end of the list, Queen Jenny was no longer pale. Her face flushed. Her blood boiled. "Alexa," she bellowed, "find Snow White at once. Tell her to come here." Queen Jenny waited until she was quite sure Alexa had gone and there was complete silence in her chambers. Then she muttered quietly to the mirror to show her the story about Mother Hubbard. In what way could her appearance these days possibly be amazing? She looked ancient, 20 years ago. When the servant finally found Snow White, she was at the poor school. It was actually known as the Bright Smiles Academy. She was reading Let Their Squeaks Rise Up, the popular old book whose official title was now The Three Mice Whose Ability to See or Otherwise is Not the Only Important Thing About Them. Snow White had just reached the scene where the farmer's wife breaks down in the witness box and confesses everything. It was she, after all, who had assaulted the victims. They had not faked their injuries to receive benefits, as the evil newspapers owned by Lord Murdoch had claimed. Cheers were about to fill the courtroom. The victim's application for damages were legitimate. "Queen wants to see you," Alexa interrupted, right at the best part of the scene. The children groaned in disappointment. A little put out to be cut off in mid-flow like this, Snow White glanced at Alexa. who, as always, remained expressionless. She sounded cross, Alexa added. Don't you worry, I'll be back in a moment, Snow White said to her students. Now, Alexa, I know my way to the palace. Perhaps you could take over the reading. As the servant, or domestic assistance executive, as was her title now, took up the book, the children groaned again. Alexa's voice was so monotone. Meanwhile, Snow White was hurrying out of the door. When Snow White reached the Queen's chambers, she found her Grace standing at a window, looking thoughtful. Beside her was a rough-looking man covered in mud and straw. At Snow White's arrival, he turned towards her with a barbaric stare. Snow White quailed as she saw the blunt-edged hatchet in his hand. On the Queen's face, she saw cold determination. Months passed, and spring turned to summer. Nothing was heard of Snow White, and in the Equality Index, the Mirror reported the Queen was back in her spot at top of the pops. Tongues wagged around the palace, as always. A petition calling to investigate the princess's disappearance gained a few hundred signatures, then fizzled out. There were dark murmurings over pints of ale in the Hare and Hounds, but the good works continued. The populace got happier day by day, and the whispers eventually stopped. Everywhere, that is, except for a cosy cottage in a corner of the forest, where Tuesdays was burrito night. Shortly after 6 p.m, the cottage's 7 inhabitants trooped in from work, tired and sweaty after another day in the mines. In previous ages, they would have been covered in coal dust too, but that sort of work was done by machines these days. And besides, being cleaner, data mining paid a whole lot more. After they'd all showered and dressed, they ate their burritos, then popped a bottle of craft beer and shuffled next door to the soundproofed studio. Testing, 1, 2, 1, 2, said Lefty. Testing levels. All good, said Lispy, holding one of a pair of cans to his right ear. Ready to go. The others took this as a signal. They sat down round the table, put on their headphones, adjusted their mics, cleared their throats, licked their lips, and waited patiently. And rolling, said Lispy. This podcast is brought to you by Dragon Drop, said Lefty. Whether you're writing a blog or building an online store, Dragon Drop offers. The others had heard this bit 1,000 times before. Well, 60-odd times at least. First there'd been their abortive debut podcast, in which they'd done episode recaps of Game of Thrones, but they soon realised everyone was in on that act. It was the oldest trick in the podcasting book. When they turned their attention to an unsolved local mystery, their podcasting really took off. Now they had a dedicated following, sponsorship deals for razors, mattresses and audiobooks, and had even been booked to record live episodes at a sprinkling of summer festivals. As the theme music, a repeated whistling refrain, faded, the podcast began. Lefty, the unspoken leader of the group, kicked things off. Hi-ho, listeners, he said. On this episode of Blood Red, the true crime podcast about the unsolved disappearance of Snow White, we'll be looking at new evidence, re-examining the known facts, and interviewing a very special guest. That's right, Lefty, said Lispy with a slight lisp, before going on to detail the evidence on offer. The others waited patiently. As hosts of the podcast, the 7 housemates were known as Lefty, Lispy, Burpy, Clever Clogs, Stinky, Hesitant, and the Monster. On the lease of the cottage, however, their names were Michael, Thomas, Dan, David, Anuvab, and Gerald. After much discussion, the group had decided upon their stage names as a branding exercise to make themselves more marketable. It had worked, after a fashion, But the only person who ever got asked for selfies was the monster, a fact the other 6 resented. The new evidence they were examining today was hardly earth-shattering. A relative of their key suspect, the huntsman, claimed to have overheard expressions of Republican sentiment in the huntsman's family home when he was growing up. This didn't exactly transform the case, but there was Republican sentiment all over the shop these days, including in the palace. Also, they had established to everyone's satisfaction by this point that the huntsman was nobody's idea of a conspirator. It was doubtful that he had the independence of thought to slice a loaf of bread of his own accord, let alone the determination to chop off a princess's head. And that's not to say anything against his upbringing. His twin sisters were a law professor and a meteorologist. If there was some sort of plot, old Hunty-Poos was the definition of an unwitting patsy. So much for the new evidence then. After making early progress in the case, the podcast had become popular and even trended for a while, but that all seemed so long ago. They now sensed the crime was not going to be solved and the podcast was outstaying its welcome. Soon there would be another ghastly murder and the next coolest new true crime podcast would come along. It was an eventuality too horrible to contemplate. They'd already heard whispers of a hot new show about 2 siblings called Jack and Jill and the horrific events that allegedly unfolded on a remote hilltop. The next section of the podcast was spent revisiting revelations made in earlier episodes and looking at the totality of evidence to see if it offered a new perspective. There was the testimony of a travelling axe sharpener, the financial irregularities in the Forest Management Service, and the sightings of a pair of brothers in the area, at the time said to be named Grimm. This was all done in the most self-serving way possible, with constant references to how the podcast had galvanised a formerly morbid investigation. Then, at long last, they came to today's guest. After all the leads we've chased that have proven to be dead ends, said Stinky, I received a tip-off last night that led me to today's guest, who I assure you is going to change everything. With that, the studio door swung open. A figure swept in. The 6 others gasped. But then at the elegance and beauty of their guest, she wore a floor-length velvet cape whose hood she slid back to reveal tumbling raven-black curls, flawless skin and a rosebud mouth. She smiled demurely, and 7 hearts broke as one. Sit here next to me, muttered the monster, stamping on Lisby's toes and pulling up a chair before Hesitant could get his act together. Away from the smell of Stinky. Ha ha! You are kind, said the stranger, and they all noted she had excellent mic technique. Now please, said Stinky, tell us your tale. Well, you see, it's all been such a big misunderstanding, said Snow White, for it was she. She told them how she'd been sent deep into the woods with the huntsman those many months before to oversee the planning and construction of an entire new village, complete with the latest accessibility equipment and a sports park for Paralympics events. It was only to be unveiled once it was finished. It hadn't been a murder at all. In fact, it was all part of a plot. At first Queen Jenny's, but later with Snow White's input too, to bring harmony to the entire forest, because this project was for animals as well as humans. It included shelters, hospitals, libraries, baths, food banks, community fridges, and free canteens for all, not to mention gymnasiums, swimming pools, sports parks, playgrounds, and landscaped pleasure gardens. And so that's why I'm here with you all today, Snow White said, to announce that, as of this moment, Village in the Woods is officially open. The episode was, of course, a killer. Never before had a true crime show had the victim walk in and introduce themselves in the final reel. Blood Red shot straight to the top of the charts and stayed there for months. There was talk of an extended live tour, a podcast-themed IPA, and even branded jerkins. Of course, any envy that Queen Jenny might have felt towards Snow White when she'd seen her stepdaughter's face in the mirror had lasted mere seconds. The Queen, a kind and thoughtful person, had immediately realised that the two women were stronger together. United, they made for a world-beating team. What had made her go pale and then blush was first the horror and then the shame that she had never realised before what a talented and determined woman her stepdaughter was. Truly it was a blessing. Now it was essential they make up for the lost time. As for the notion that she would ever compete with a younger woman, out of jealousy, ludicrous. Thus they all lived, not happily ever after, which everyone knows is unrealistic, but with much more sensible ambitions and manageable expectations of contentment that they could plan and work together towards a bright future, which is probably as good as you can have it, right? That's the end. Hope you enjoyed.